I want to address a very controversial issue and, of course, express my own view about it, and that is a certain aspect of what we call conflicting memories. The Czech Senate passed in 2008 a resolution recognizing the victims of Soviet totalitarianism and Nazi Germany in the same way. In other words, equating the victimhood of the victims of these two regimes. This was picked up by the European Parliament in 2009, and it was determined that the 23rd of August, the date on which, in 1939, the Neutrality Pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany was signed, to have that as a memorial day for the victims equally of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, this, of course, created a tremendous argument and so on. I think what it implies is that the two regimes are equally responsible for World War II and, by implication, for the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust was explicitly removed from this equation by the European Parliament decision, but that seems rather odd, because if you exclude the genocide of the Jews from the victims of Nazi Germany, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So we have an equation there. Now, this is understandable for, let us say, the Baltic republics, for Poland, perhaps for others, because the Soviet occupation of the Baltic republics, of half of Poland, of Bessarabia and Northern Bukovina, were the result of this Neutrality Pact. And Soviet occupation came in two distinct time frames, especially in the Baltic republics, between June 1940 and June 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. And then there came about 3.5 years of German occupation, and then another 45 years of Soviet occupation. And from the point of view of many of these peoples, not only the Baltic republics, the Soviet regime was much more in evidence. It was a constant period of oppression and discrimination and brutality and terror in these countries. And so, in effect, the Nazi occupation, especially in the Baltic republics, but also elsewhere, was a kind of a temporary thing. It was relatively brief as compared to the Soviet occupation. Now, let me take an example from a democratic country which made a tremendous non-military effort, largely successful, to free itself from the Soviet regime. But it's only an example, because I could use other examples as well, is Latvia. There were deportations from Latvia between 1940 and 41 in the first Soviet occupation. Some 15,400 people were deported to the interior of the Soviet Union. Another 3,000 were jailed, tortured, discriminated against, suffered within Latvia. Of these, 11.7% were Jews. But the Jews were only less than 5% of the population. So, proportionately speaking, more Jews were deported into the Soviet Union than ethnic Latvians. After 1944, between 1944 basically until 1949-50, another 43,000 Latvian citizens were deported into the interior of the Soviet Union. Most of these came back after the death of Stalin in 1953. They were, many of them, broken in spirit and in body, but they came back. To say that that is a genocide and compare it to genocidal policies of Nazi Germany is extremely problematic. There was no genocide of the Latvian people. There was no genocide of the Jewish minority within the Latvian Republic, because clearly the genocide occurred after that, during the Nazi regime. And in these countries, if you go from the Baltic Sea south, the actual murder of the Jews was done somewhere, in some places in large part, in some places in very large part, and in some places in part by local collaborating forces, local forces that collaborated with Nazi Germany. Lithuanian Jews were murdered largely by Lithuanians, under German orders and under German command. The same applies to other places. So you see, this is very problematic to compare that then with the Soviet occupation. Now, who was responsible for the war? Stalin would have sold not only his own mother, if she was still alive, but all the Russian mothers in 1938, 1939, in order to avoid a war in which he knew, after the annihilation of the Soviet military leadership by the Soviet regime in 1937, that he would never be able to withstand the force, the onslaught of Nazi Germany's army. And so they were looking for a way out. And until 1939, they were looking for an alliance with the West in order to be able to withstand Nazi Germany. As late as June 1939, 2.5 months before the outbreak of war, there were negotiations going on in Leningrad, today St. Petersburg, between a military delegation from Britain and France and Marshal Voroshilov, one of the 3 surviving marshals of the Soviet Union. The others had been murdered. Now, Voroshilov was no Einstein, and nor were the other 2 Soviet marshals that survived, Budyonny and Timoshenko. They were rather mediocre personalities. But Voroshilov represented Stalin, of course. And in those negotiations, Voroshilov asked the British and the French military, if we face Nazi Germany, what will you contribute to the common effort? And the British said, quite correctly, we have only 6 divisions ready. 4 of them are busy elsewhere, including training in the United Kingdom. We have only 2 divisions, but these we will be ready to send to the continent. And the French said, we have the Maginot Line between France and Germany. We will defend ourselves against the German onslaught there. To which the Soviets replied, okay, well, that means that you put all the burden on us. They didn't say that we are incapable of carrying it, but that's what was behind it. And so the Soviets said, we cannot expose ourselves to that danger. We have to come to an accommodation with Germany, especially as Nazi Germany is very much interested in this, and it was quite prepared to hand over to the Soviet Union territories which it did not control itself, namely half of Poland, Eastern Poland at that time, the Baltic republics, and ultimately also part of what was then Romania. So, who was responsible for the outbreak of the war? Clearly, Nazi Germany, not the Soviet Union. Not only that, why did they want a war? Now, there's any volume that you like of historical research on that. But I would suggest, and this is something that some of my colleagues and I have developed over the last years, it is perfectly clear to us that while there were certainly economic and political and other considerations of the Nazi leaders, the basic motivation was ideological. Can that be proved? Yes, it can be proved. one of the most significant documents is a personal memorandum that Hitler wrote to number 2 in Nazi Germany, namely Hermann Göring, who was to be the economic Tsar, if you like, of Nazi Germany, and develop a 4-year plan to prepare Germany for war. Göring was to be nominated in October 1936. And before that, he asked Hitler to give him a written explanation of why this has to be done, so that he should have a document in hand. This is the only memorandum that we know that Hitler himself wrote. And that's what it looks like too, because the man didn't know his own language. And what it said in that memorandum was a private memorandum, not a propaganda piece, not for publication, was that Germany faced a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, which, if it came to fruition, it would endanger the physical existence of the German people. And the aim of that conspiracy, explicitly stated, was to remove all the leading strata of all the countries in the world and replace them by international Jewry. As against this danger, the only way was war. This was complemented in something that most of you know and have seen because it was filmed and at least read. The January 30 Hitler speech in the Reichstag, in which he said, and this is very important, that should the Jewish financiers in Europe and outside it, by which he meant America, again involve the world in a world war. Again, that means that they did it already in World War I. Then the result would not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thereby the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Now, what does that mean? It means that the Jewish financiers in the West are the same as the Jewish Bolsheviks in the East, because their aim of the Jewish financiers, of the capitalists, is to Bolshevize the world. Does that sound odd or irrational? To a non-Nazi mind, yes. To a Nazi mind, it was perfectly rational. Because the Jew was the devil, the Satan, coming both in a very small bacteria form and a tremendous physical danger. So you can be both a capitalist and a Bolshevik, and the two things are connected. What I'm saying here is that the ideological motivation for the war to break out was based on anti-Semitism. The result was 35 million dead in World War II in Europe alone. Of these, as I said yesterday, and I will insist on that, the number of Jewish victims was about 5.7 million. But the other 29 million were non-Jews. And they died in large part because of anti-Semitism, which is one of the justifications for the ITF to exist. Because this is a global issue, a worldwide issue. To compare that and equate that with Soviet terrorism and Soviet oppression is to equate, yes, two totalitarian regimes, but completely different from each other. You see, the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed of itself because of a mendacious ideology, because of internal corruption, because of inefficiency, because of lack of internal justification, because of a terror that reached its end. It collapsed of itself. Nazi Germany could never collapse of itself. It had to be defeated by military force. It's a huge difference between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, should the victims of Soviet terrorism be recognized and remembered? Most certainly, yes. I think one should be in favor of designing whatever date is chosen for the victims of the Soviet totalitarian regime. Yes. But to say that the victims of both regimes are the same is wrong. One last point. The Nazis intended to annihilate the East European, or many of the East European peoples as such, as the Convention on Genocide of 1948 passed by the United Nations says explicitly. What do I mean by annihilation as such? What they meant was, and this was recorded in stages, in 3 documents that are called Generalplan Ost, the General Plan East, which was developed in Nazi Germany between 1941 and 1943. And this was published for the first time by a Polish historian who found the documentation. His name was Czesław Madajczyk. The idea of the Generalplan Ost was that, for instance, the Baltic nationalities would no longer exist, that they would be in part Germanized, in part killed, the ones who would not fit the kind of regime that Nazi Germany wanted to establish, and in part would become slaves or servants of Nazi Germany. This was explicitly stated by an SS intellectual who prepared these documents one after the other. And this was then approved by the SS, presumably because we don't know the detailed negotiations, detailed contacts between Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler. They were never recorded. Clearly indicating that the Baltic nationalities would no longer exist under Nazi rule. This is the annihilation of a group as such, not necessarily killing every member of those groups. As far as the Poles were concerned, there would be no physical annihilation. This was explicitly stated, except for that minority amongst the Poles who opposed the Germans. But they needed a Helot population, a slave population, and the Poles would work for Nazi Germany, by force, of course. The same applies to the Czechs. That was the idea. So the annihilation of national groups as such, for instance, the Czechs, the Poles, the Baltic nations, was envisaged by Nazi Germany a clear genocidal intent. Clear genocidal intent. But the Satan, of course, were the Jews. They had to be annihilated physically, totally. That was the extreme form of genocide that they proposed. So, conflicting memories can lead us astray, can lead us into a comparison that is inappropriate, that is counterproductive. We have to be very, very clear, I think, that those are 2 separate, brutal, terrorist regimes, but they are different from each other. The Soviets never planned the annihilation of the Polish people as such. They never planned the annihilation, certainly not the Czechs. They never planned the annihilation of Estonians, Lithuanians, and Latvians either. Soviet regime between 1944 and 1989 was, yes, directed from Moscow, of course. But the people on the spot were Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. And they received some support from the local population, which now we tend to forget a bit. There was support for the Soviet regime. Not overwhelming, but it was there. If I take the examples of Lithuania, for instance, there was a Lithuanian intellectual who was supposedly the president of Soviet Lithuania, Justas Paleckis. And in Latvia, it was a professor of biology, not a marginal figure at all, August Kirchensteins, and so on. So we have a clear indication that there was no Soviet intent of genocide. There was a Soviet intent of oppression, brutality, and so on and so forth. We have to differentiate between these things. We have to be clear, and I'm returning at the end to us as a international intergovernmental body. We have to be clear that when people compare these two regimes, let's be extremely careful and see that there are gradations, there are differences, and as far as our own theme is concerned, the genocide of the Jewish people, that was planned not by the Soviets, although the Soviets oppressed the Jews and discriminated and all the rest of it. There was no intent for a genocide. There was not only an intent on the Nazi side, there was a serious attempt to put it into practice. Thank you.